All right. So my name is Alicia Vasto. I'm the Water Program Director here at IEC, and with me is our staff attorney, Mike Schmidt, and we're going to be presenting to you all today. So just as an overview of what we're going to discuss, I'm going to provide a bit of a background on threats to drinking water in Iowa's karst region and some information on private well contamination in Iowa's karst region. Then I'm going to provide some background on Iowa's failure to address nitrate pollution. Mike is going to talk about the AFO, the animal feeding operation rulemaking process that we participated in, and then give some information on the petition that we submitted to EPA. And then we'll talk a little bit about what's next. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Iowa Environmental Council, we are a statewide nonprofit organization. We work on law and policy issues related to water, land, climate, and energy here in Iowa. And we're a coalition. So we represent over 100 member organizations that are other nonprofits or businesses in the state of Iowa who share our goal of creating a just, healthy environment and sustainable future for all Iowans. So some background on threats to drinking water in Iowa's karst region. So what is Iowa's karst region? This is a map of the karst area in Iowa overlaid with what is known as the Driftless area. And the Driftless area covers a portion of southeast Minnesota, southwest Wisconsin, northwest Illinois, and northeast Iowa. And so it is a part of the country that was unglaciated and has this unique karst terrain. And so I'm going to kind of be using these terms interchangeably. So what is karst terrain? Karst terrain is a kind of bedrock formation that is very soluble and means that there can easily be sinkholes that form. There are a lot of caves and springs in these regions because the bedrock is so soluble. So there's a lot of limestone and rocks like that that can allow for easy transportation of surface water into groundwater. So it's a very vulnerable kind of landscape because it allows for this quick movement, and that means that pollution can move very quickly as well. So in this region, we have a lot of medium and large CAFOs, or concentrated animal feeding operations. So CAFOs are common in our state as a whole, but there are also, of course, many of them there in the Driftless region. And so, CAFOs have a lot of animals, and they produce a lot of manure. And that manure is stored at the site at which it is produced, and then it gets applied as fertilizer during the year to provide nutrients to crops. So that is a risk to drinking water sources because it can contaminate those sources very easily. And so the manure contains nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen. And then, of course, there's also commercial fertilizers that get applied that also provide those nutrients. And so the threat here of nitrate pollution is what we're really focused on. So nitrate is a risk in drinking water. As an acute risk, it can cause blue baby syndrome, which is what the drinking water standard of 10 milligrams per liter is based on. So we don't really see blue baby syndrome anymore because we have this drinking water standard. But there's more and more evidence that nitrate is also linked to long-term low exposure impacts such as bladder, thyroid, and ovarian cancers. It's also been linked to birth defects. And then, of course, nitrate and phosphorus can also lead to harmful algae blooms, which when they occur in our surface waterways, they can produce cyanotoxins that are harmful to human health. And then there are financial costs associated with this pollution. So there are many public water systems in our state that are having to deal with elevated nitrate levels. And then there are expenses associated with treating that water to make sure that it meets the drinking water standard. And then there are expenses for the medical costs associated with the health impacts of nitrate. There can be economic losses of like lake recreation and tourism when there are these algae blooms. And then, of course, there are private wells that are contaminated and have individual treatment costs as well. And private wells are not regulated in the same way that public water systems are. So that is on the private well owner to manage. And so we see a lot of headlines like this, risks to private wells, trout streams in Northeast Iowa that are threatened by expanding CAFOs, and then these studies that are showing more and more about these health impacts of nitrate pollution. So looking at the private wells in Iowa's karst region, what do we find associated with these kinds of pollution and the threats to drinking water? So this map is information from the private well tracking system that Iowa has. And so these tests are done through the Grants to Counties program, which provides funding for private well testing. So even though the private wells are unregulated by the state does have funding available to help well owners test their wells and make sure that they're in good shape. So, unfortunately, though, a lot of these wells are contaminated with nitrate above the drinking water standard. And so, in those cases, the private well owner has to find a new drinking water source or treat their well in order to provide drinking water through that source. So, this is just a map of those nitrate levels. The red is, above the drinking water standard. Um, and looking at the data with the most recent set of data from 2016 to 2023, these are the number of wells in each county that tested above that level. And there's a pretty big discrepancy here from county to county, and that can have to do with the number of wells that are in the county, with the frequency at which the wells are tested and the Grants to County program is utilized in the county. And also just the individual differences in the wells, how deep they are, and what aquifer they're drawing from. So we see a really high amount in Delaware County as well as Clayton County. And just kind of as an overall picture of this, we did a comparison of the wells in the Driftless area compared to all of the wells in Iowa that are tested through the Grants to Counties program. And the wells in the Driftless are more likely to have nitrate contamination than wells across the state. So that is a major cause for concern in this area. And then looking at the results from 2016 to 2023, we found that more than 10% of the nitrate well tests were above that 10 milligram per liter nitrate drinking water standard. And almost 40 of them, or 40% of them, tested at a level that indicated human sources of nitrogen. So what has Iowa done to try to address nitrate pollution? I'm going to give kind of an overview of the state laws and programs that we have to try to address this problem and talk about how they just haven't been able to really help with the situation that we find ourselves in. So one of the laws that you might look to is the Groundwater Protection Act. This was a major piece of environmental legislation that passed in 1987 here in Iowa. And that law has a lot of really great language about the importance of groundwater and the importance of protecting it from contamination. It created the funding mechanism for the Grants to Counties program, which is really important. However, it really focused on municipal landfills and industrial waste and didn't really address the source of contamination that is most prevalent in our state, which is agricultural pollution. So it did not address agriculture and created an exemption for it. The private well testing was created out of the Grants to Counties program, as I mentioned. And so that program provides money for testing of private wells, as well as reconstructing them, or if they find deficiencies in the wells, and then plugging them. But it does not provide funding for drinking water mitigation. So if you find contamination in your well, you cannot use grants to counties monies to um, put in a reverse osmosis system that might treat the water or something like that. So um, that is where it kind of falls behind, but it does provide this great data set for us to be able to look at. In 2023, there were nearly 5,000 wells tested across the state of Iowa. We also have this designation in our state, the Outstanding Waters of Iowa. And so this designation is under the Clean Water Act. There's an anti-degradation provision. And basically this tier of waterways is designated as the most uh, outstanding natural resources that we have. And so there are a few more factors that are considered when there are potential discharges to those waterways. And we find most of these waterways in Northeast Iowa. These are a lot of cold water trout streams that are unique to that area because of the karst landscape. There are a few outside of that area, of course. There's West Okoboji Lake and Big Spirit Lake, but most of them are in these counties that we're looking at when we talk about the karst region of Iowa. And this designation does not help with the non-point sources of pollution like agriculture, but it does help with point sources, so restricting discharges that are allowable through the permitting system of the Clean Water Act. Iowa has a nutrient reduction strategy, which was adopted by the state in 2013 and was officially adopted into state code in 2018 as the state's policy for addressing nutrient pollution. So nutrients being nitrogen and phosphorus. And so this has been in place for 10 years, and the goal is to reduce pollution that's leaving the state and helping to cause the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Unfortunately, this strategy relies on entirely voluntary compliance for the non-point source side of things. So the agricultural pollution, the approach is all voluntary to putting in conservation practices that are going to help reduce pollution from those sources. And so what we found is that this voluntary approach is not working, and voluntary has been the approach for addressing this pollution even before the nutrient reduction strategy was implemented. So long term, overall, we're not seeing a change in the nitrate load that is leaving the state of Iowa. And so we really believe that we need more than voluntary solutions to addressing this problem. And then lastly, another solution to helping address nutrient pollution would be establishing numeric nutrient criteria. And so this is something that the Iowa Environmental Council has long pushed for. We've asked for numeric standards as opposed to narrative standards, which is what we have now, which are much more subjective in their interpretation. Having a numeric standard would be a bright line standard that would allow us to really assess our waterways and try to set more restrictions on pollution sources. So the state has had an opportunity to adopt numeric criteria for many years, but they have not taken that opportunity or embarked on looking into that opportunity. So that's something that we'll continue to push for, and that other states have adopted, but Iowa is lagging behind on. So That's kind of the overview of the background of all of the factors that went into our work on this petition. But I will pass it to Mike to talk about the AFO rulemaking process that we also went through the last few years.
Thanks, Alicia. I am not able to turn on my video, so I don't know if you can change my panelist or make me a co-host. Great, thank you. All right, so Alicia gave a lot of great background. I wanted to talk about things that IEC has done more recently to try to address some of the water quality problems that Alicia talked about. One thing that we did in the last couple of years was to work on rules that address animal feeding operations. Next slide, please. Rules are how agencies interpret and implement the laws that are passed by the legislature. The rules that the agencies adopt have the force and effect of law. This process that the agencies go through to adopt rules includes the Environmental Protection Commission in Iowa for rules that DNR implements. In practice, that means that the DNR drafts the rules and proposes those. They go through a public notice and comment process. The Environmental Protection Commission then adopts the rules, and they have the effect of laws at that point. So normally, it is the state agency that initiates that process and goes through the process. But the State's Administrative Procedure Act also allows anyone to petition for new rules. That's what IEC did. Next slide. In 2021, IEC, with our partners Environmental Law and Policy Center, petitioned for new rules regulating animal feeding operations. We focused some of these requests or requested changes on karst terrain that Alicia talked about earlier. One of the changes we asked for was to increase the vertical separation from karst to landforms. So that means the bottom of the manure storage pit needs to be at least 25 feet above the karst terrain instead of just 5 feet. Right now, the rules require 5 feet of separation unless the manure storage structure is designed by a professional engineer or the Natural Resources Conservation Service. In that case, there's actually no minimum separation distance. We asked for a change to have an absolute minimum of 5 feet and typically a requirement of 25 feet. That means that if there is some leak, it doesn't go straight into the karst terrain that lets it get into aquifers, surface water, and drinking water sources. We also asked for changes to protect drinking water by requiring more monitoring. So if there is some kind of leak, if there is some kind of manure escaping from the facility, then there will be more monitoring to catch that, identify the problem, and allow people to fix it. We asked for a couple of changes in rule that would allow the DNR to deny a facility based on the unique conditions or the cumulative impact in an area. So if there's an area that already has so many CAFOs, so many concentrated animal feeding operations, and so much manure that the cropland can't take anymore, we probably should not have any more facilities being put in that spot. Unfortunately, in February 2022, the Environmental Protection Commission voted on DNR's recommendation to deny our petition. The DNR and EPC said that the DNR would initiate a broader rulemaking soon, addressing not just karst issues, but other changes to the rules. And so they did not want to move ahead with the proposed changes that we had provided. IEC waited a few months and, not seeing any action from DNR, filed another petition in May of 2022. In this petition, we requested DNR adopt, or the EPC adopt, a 100-year floodplain map. This was something that the legislature had instructed DNR to develop and adopt in 2002, and 20 years later, the department had not done it, so we asked for that to be done at this point. Next slide. The petition and subsequent rulemaking process did lead to some proposed changes by DNR. DNR came out with draft rules in September 2022, a few months after our second petition was filed. And we started a comment process, or participated in a comment process. The DNR started after that. The DNR accepted those comments, sent the rules to the governor's office for pre-clearance, basically pre-approval. But before the governor's office actually acted on that request, the governor came out with Executive Order 10, which imposed a moratorium on all agency rulemaking, not just for DNR, all agencies statewide. It also required that before agencies adopt rules, they go through a cost-benefit analysis, a regulatory analysis process, looking at whether the rules were the least cost or the least burdensome way to move ahead with achieving the goals of the rules. It also required that agencies rescind and readopt all of their rules over the next 3 years, and the agencies had to reduce the burden and reduce the restrictive language in their rules through the 3-year review process. Following that, DNR came out with a new version of their rules. We commented on it with a number of partners. DNR did the regulatory analysis, that cost-benefit analysis required by the executive order, and we commented on that as well, along with a new draft of the rules. And finally, in October of 2023, DNR sent those rules to the governor's office for pre-clearance. The governor's office did not approve those rules as DNR sent them initially in October 2023, and instead, the governor's office approved rules that did not have any additional karst protections. DNR had not proposed the level of karst protection that we had petitioned for, but had initially proposed some changes to karst that would have added some protections. After the governor's office did not approve those changes and instead approved essentially the existing requirements for karst terrain, the Environmental Protection Commission voted to move into a formal rulemaking process and ultimately adopted those rules without changes to karst terrain. As a result, we decided to take further action. Next slide. We decided to file a petition to EPA under the Safe Drinking Water Act. Next slide. A lot of IEC's work is done under the Clean Water Act, which focuses on surface waters and focuses on point sources. Generally, that means pipes. However, agricultural stormwater is exempt from the Clean Water Act permit requirements. The Safe Drinking Water Act has a different scope. It focuses on drinking water quality. States can apply for primacy, which gives them authority to implement the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act within their jurisdictions, and creates obligations for them to ensure that people have clean drinking water. The Safe Drinking Water Act focuses on drinking water quality, and generally that means finished drinking water quality, what actually comes out of people's taps. There are also requirements, though, that address source water protection. So that's the water that is being used for drinking water before it's treated. Next slide. One of the things that the Safe Drinking Water Act includes is emergency powers for EPA. Iowa's Safe Drinking Water Act requirements are administered by the Department of Natural Resources, which has to protect public sources of drinking water. But there are opportunities for EPA to get involved if public drinking water sources are at risk. A public drinking water source has a specific definition. It's a water source that has 15 service connections or serves 25 or more people. So it includes wells that are used to serve towns, but also those that might serve large residential or transient populations, like nursing homes or schools. It does not regulate the quality of private wells directly. But if those public water supplies or sources of drinking water are not protected, then EPA can step in using this emergency authority. EPA has to receive information that contamination may present imminent and substantial endangerment to the health of persons, and that state and local authorities have not acted. So that means there are two pieces here. There has to be contamination that is endangering the public health, and there has to be a lack of action by the state to actually protect public health. Next slide. To interpret those terms, EPA put out a guidance memo in 2018. This followed EPA's involvement in the Flint water crisis in Flint, Michigan, where the drinking water was contaminated by lead. And so EPA realized that there might be instances where it needs to use this authority, needs to intervene, and it needed to explain exactly how it would be doing that going forward. So it updated guidance that had not been updated for more than 15 years before that. Next slide. So those terms I mentioned before have some specific meaning under EPA's guidance. First, the agency may act upon information that it receives about a problem. That is different from a specific burden of proof. It doesn't mean there has to be complete evidence. There just has to be enough information to show that there are problems that need to be addressed. This is a lower bar than you might see in a court case. It just means there's enough information for EPA to start getting involved. Next, the term contaminant has some specific meaning as well. Under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the guidance document to implement the emergency authority, it's clear that nitrate is considered a contaminant. There's a federal requirement that drinking water be below 10 milligrams per liter to protect against acute problems from nitrate in drinking water. EPA's authority to use its emergency powers extends to public water systems, but it also includes underground sources of drinking water. That's the next term. Underground sources of drinking water are defined as sources that serve a public water system or could serve a public water system. Essentially, any aquifer could serve a public water system at some point. So the EPA's authority to protect these underground sources of drinking water is quite broad. The guidance document specifically notes this means that the authority can extend to aquifers that serve private wells and are not public water supplies if those aquifers could serve public water supplies. Finally, imminent and substantial endangerment to human health. So the guidance document explains you don't have to show specific people being injured or that the harm has already occurred. The threat of harm is sufficient. And being an imminent threat simply means that the conditions causing or potentially causing harm are present, even if the harm itself may not develop for years. The guidance gives a specific example of a nitrate MCL violation, which was very helpful for purposes of this petition. Substantial can mean a few different things. That the likelihood of ingestion is high, the likelihood of disease is high upon ingestion, or that the harm could be great. The memo explains that public health may be endangered imminently and substantially, both by a lesser risk of greater harm or a greater risk of lesser harm. So that's the bucket of information that EPA needs to receive, that there's contamination, it's affecting underground sources of drinking water, and there's an imminent and substantial endangerment to the public. Next slide. There's also some helpful examples in the guidance document. It specifically calls out karst geology as one possible way that EPA might need to intervene. So if EPA chooses to intervene, it has pretty broad discretion in how it does that. And this example from the guidance document shows that the exact situation we have in Iowa is an appropriate use of EPA's emergency authority to intervene. Next slide. The second piece that needs to be shown, though, is that the state is not addressing the problem to protect public health sufficiently. If the state is doing a good job and is protecting public health, then there's no need for EPA to step in. But EPA doesn't need to affirmatively determine that the state is doing an inadequate job to actually step in or find that the state has failed to act entirely. The state might be trying to do some things, it's just not doing enough. Under those circumstances, EPA can step in and proceed with actions under Section 1431, its emergency authority. Next slide. There have been several past petitions and EPA actions where EPA used this authority to require some specific steps by states or by pollution sources. In the region, there was a petition in 2014 in Kewaunee County, Wisconsin, addressing nitrate pollution in karst terrain. There have also been other petitions more recently addressing nitrate contamination in drinking water sources. And most recently in 2023, there was one in southeast Minnesota. Next slide. The EPA response to Minnesota was quite interesting to us. Minnesota petitioned in April of 2023, and in November of 2023, EPA responded, finding that based on the information submitted in Minnesota's petition, there were more than 9,000 residents at risk of consuming water above the drinking water nitrate standard. It also determined that there was need for further action, so the state was not doing enough, and it required Minnesota agencies through this letter shown on the right to start taking action. And EPA would ensure that the Minnesota agencies were being held accountable in addressing the nitrate pollution in southeast Minnesota. The facts of the Minnesota case are extremely similar to Iowa because it's the same geologic formation, southeast Minnesota and northeast Iowa. The driftless area and the karst terrain does not follow a political boundary. It is a geological formation. So Iowa has the same types of pollution, same types of risk to underground sources of drinking water, and similarly, many residents who are drinking water that is at 10 milligrams per liter or higher. Next slide. Because of those similarities and the threats to Iowans, we worked with a number of petitioners, including a mix of local, statewide, and national groups, to file a petition for EPA to intervene in Iowa as well. Next slide. We asked, at a minimum, for EPA to do what it is requiring in Minnesota, because we have the same geologic formation, the same pollution, and the same risks to public health. At a minimum, this means EPA needs to create a communication plan to ensure that everybody knows what's going on, ensure that we identify which residences are on private wells that may be exceeding 10 milligrams per liter of nitrate, and also inform all of those folks that they need to take action and to provide a plan for providing clean drinking water for all of those residents. We also asked the EPA to publish public records on the scope and severity of contamination and the response by the state and EPA, and provide regular updates on what's going on. Finally, and importantly, we need a long-term solution. We can't just give people bottled water and think that we're done. We need to actually clean up our polluted drinking water sources. Next slide. Beyond what EPA did in Minnesota, we asked for some additional steps. Minnesota has several different programs that Iowa does not have. That includes things like permits for a large number of concentrated animal feeding operations. Minnesota issues permits or issues a general permit covering more than 1,200 facilities. Iowa has even more concentrated animal feeding operations, but fewer than 200 of those with permits under the Clean Water Act. We also asked the EPA to investigate other potential sources of nitrate pollution. We know that there could be sources other than CAFOs. We asked for a specific timetable for implementation. We know that EPA might require things of the state, but we want to know, how long is this going to take? We also asked for assistance for private well owners to ensure that they have access to clean drinking water, and impose more monitoring and discharge requirements for potential sources so that we can actually make progress toward the long-term cleanup that's needed. And finally, if necessary, EPA could take civil enforcement action against polluters who are causing these problems. And with that, I will turn it to Alicia to talk about what's next.
Great. Thanks, Mike. So as far as what we're expecting next, we think that EPA will likely respond to our petition after the election. If we're under the same timeline as the Minnesota petition, that would be a November response. And so we wouldn't expect them to respond right before the election, but hopefully afterwards. In the meantime, we're going to continue our advocacy for the solutions that we have asked for in the petition. Um, and we're also going to be developing some legislative priorities that we will base off what we anticipate the EPA will respond with. In Minnesota, there were several bills that were introduced in the legislature as a response to, what EPA requested and their response to the petition. So we would expect that the legislature would need to take action to help address some of these issues. And then finally, if the EPA does not respond in a timely fashion, we will be considering further actions that are available to us. So hopefully we'll have some more updates within 2024 and otherwise within the year for you all. So what can you do in the meantime? If you're not already signed up for our email list, I would encourage you to sign up and get updates from us regularly about the work that we're doing on this and on other issues. You'll also find opportunities to take action when there are comment making opportunities with the different agencies or opportunities to take action to reach out to your lawmakers and decision makers. We also have a toolkit available if you're interested in writing a letter to the editor or an op-ed for your local paper. So please check that out if you're interested in using your voice to raise up the information and the conversation about these topics. And then lastly, I always have to make the ask to support our program. The water program here at IEC really relies on your donations to make work like this possible. So if you support this work, please consider making a donation to us. So I'll leave that QR code up for a little bit for you all to consider that. So with that, that is all of the information that we have prepared for you. So we have time for Q&A. I think that we have a few questions in the Q&A box. So let me find those really quickly. All right. So the first question that we have here in the Q&A is, why aren't the upper Cedar River karst areas included? I have a thought on that, but Mike, did you want to take a first crack at that?
Yeah, so one of the things we thought about was to try to make this petition as similar to the Minnesota one as possible. I didn't get into it, but Minnesota is in a different EPA region from Iowa, and the response that Minnesota got came from the regional administrator for Region 5, which covers the Great Lakes. Iowa is in Region 7, which includes Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, and Kansas. And so we thought it would make sense to try to get a similar response from Region 5 for essentially just the same area, continuation of the area that Minnesota had gotten a response to. Alicia, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I would just also say that, we had been, through the rulemaking process that Mike is talking about when we first petitioned for increased rules, that we just had more information because we had been working on issues that were focused on the Driftless area specifically. So I think, though, that, any response that we get from EPA could be much more broadly applicable than just the region that we asked for to be looked at in the petition, and could also be applicable statewide. So I think that there could be a lot of benefits from getting an EPA response that will help people in all of these areas. So the next question that we have here is about talking with congressional candidates on the issue and making them aware of it. Do we have a talking points document that we can use and leave with them? I shared a link to the fact sheet that we created and put that in the chat. We do not have a talking points document specifically, but that's something that we can certainly think about putting together, and I'll let you know if we prepare one of those and can send it to you. So thank you. Let's see. Here's another question. Can others join in on the EPA petition? So, Mike, I don't know about late
Yeah,
sign-ons.
I don't know that it is really open for additions at this point. But if folks have other information that would be helpful to share with EPA, we can certainly send that on to EPA.
Another question here says, do you know if the nitrates are from manure rather than legacy nitrates from chemical fertilizers? So I would say that, knowing how quickly the water can move from the surface to the groundwater sources in the karst area, and how a lot of these private wells are drawing from alluvial aquifers, those are more likely to be more recent nitrates rather than legacy nitrates. I'd also say that there have been some studies up in that region out of Luther College that do tracing of E. coli. So trying to trace the sources of that E. coli, whether that's human or livestock. And so they have found, that quite a bit of the E. coli is from these manure sources, as well as human sources. So, we would assume that the nitrate would also be coming from those similar sources as well. But I don't think that there have been studies about whether or not there are legacy nitrates necessarily that are in the drinking water sources. Another question here is, how much legal weight does a potential positive response from EPA to your petition hold? Is there recourse if the state of Iowa decides to ignore a response from the EPA?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. I think generally federal law overrides state law, and so EPA intervening and taking action can force the state to do things, or EPA can force individual parties to do things. So if the state does not take action in response to an EPA order or requirement to do something, then EPA can itself intervene. So this is a way to basically get around the state's failure to act. So the state itself does not have to take all of the actions, and EPA can take action itself.
All right. So another question here, do you think that there are other sources of nitrates impacting wells besides manure fertilizer? So yes, there's definitely evidence of that in other studies. I think that Mike mentioned the Kewaunee, Wisconsin petition, that they have done sourcing of manure and E. coli, and found that a lot of septic systems were impacting those wells. And I think that they've done studies that found that as well in southern Minnesota. So, a lot of folks that are on private wells are also on individual private septic systems. And when those systems are inefficient, that can end up impacting private drinking water sources as well. So that is one of the things that we included in the petition is, trying to look at other sources of the nitrates that are contaminating the water beyond just CAFOs. So that could include septic systems or potentially other sources of nitrates as well. A question here, are you thinking the EPA will take action, or will issues need to get a lot worse before they pay attention? Mike, do you want to?
Sure. I would expect EPA to, at a minimum, require what it has been requiring in Minnesota. Um, like I mentioned, Minnesota has had some regulatory requirements that Iowa does not. And if even those are insufficient to address the problem, the EPA is requiring more of the state. I would expect the same for Iowa, if not more.
Question here, how long do you think it will take the EPA to respond, and what would you anticipate for the Trump administration EPA response if he's elected? So, as I mentioned, I wouldn't think that they would respond until after the election. Um, I think that, you know, basically if Trump is elected, um, I think that we would really try to pressure the EPA to respond before he took office, because I don't think that we would get a response from the Trump administration, quite frankly. So the petition that was filed in 2014 in Wisconsin, the EPA still has not responded to. So I think because this current EPA did respond to the Minnesota petition pretty quickly, and they have an interest in addressing rural issues, that we could really try to make it a priority for them to respond to our petition in a similar time frame or similar fashion. Let's see, another question here. What can public health organizations who may be new to tackling environmental issues do to best support your work? What's the most effective messaging, especially for folks who may not see the environmental and human health connections? I think that's a great question. I would be really interested in talking with you and meeting. I think that, yeah, talking about the human health impacts of these issues is really crucially important to make it really real for people and really help them understand the like real world implications. When people talk about nitrate, it can seem like, just this very intangible kind of thing. You can't see nitrate, right, in the water. So making sure that people understand the actual impacts is really important, and anything that we can do to be communicating about that and have better messaging is really important to make sure that this issue gets more attention and that we can take actions that are actually going to be beneficial in addressing the problems. So I would love to talk more with anyone who is interested in working on this together and getting the messaging out there more effectively. Um, let's see. What's next? Oh, can you go back to the slide with the links? I will go back. One more slide here to show.
I did share those in that chat as well.
Oh, you did. Thank you. Okay. How does this tie into the fact that oftentimes CAFOs are a smaller percentage of a basin and actually are the permit shield to looking more closely at the nitrogen fertilizers being applied to row crops and other non-point sources that make up a greater percentage of the impacts within a basin? How much are folks demanding monitoring and soil testing as part of the process?
So I'll note that in Minnesota, one of the things that the state will be undertaking is changes to the rules applicable to animal feeding operations, and also changes to the manure management plans. So those are the plans that say, here's how much manure we're applying as fertilizer and where. That manure application rate was something we commented on in the AFO rulemaking. But it's true that it is not just manure, it's also commercial fertilizer, synthetic fertilizer that contributes to this. And so part of what we need is a larger shift, not just regulation of what's going on in terms of manure management, but also a shift away from as intensive as I guess a less intensive row crop agricultural system that's not just based on corn and soybeans. One of the things that we included in the petition was a couple of pictures comparing the land use in the area and how it has intensified in terms of row crop usage. Some areas are better suited for alfalfa or other perennial crops rather than corn and soybeans. So that's something that people have to think about in terms of protecting water quality and drinking water sources.
All right. Great. Another question here. Any potential to update Iowa's Groundwater Protection Act? I would say, yeah, I would say, when I'm, my next kind of task with this is to start looking at legislative priorities related to this. And yeah, I'd love to go back and look at the Groundwater Protection Act and see if there are places where that could be strengthened to help address some of these issues. And if anyone has ideas, I'm very open to hearing from you and considering that and working on it in the interim here. We have a few months before the next legislative session, so that could certainly be an opportunity. Mike, did you have any other thoughts on that?
Nope.
Great. All right. Well, that is all of the questions that we had in the Q&A box. I do see that there's a hand raised from Becky Ortman. So Becky, I'm going to push this allow to talk button to see if you are interested in saying something here. But in the meantime, if anybody else has any other questions in the Q&A, please enter those in. We have just a few minutes left here.
I'll just catch up with you later, Alicia, okay?
Yep, sounds great. Thanks, Becky.
Thank you.
All right. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here today. Oh, sorry, we just had one pop up here. So are you coordinating your petitions with the editorial department of the Des Moines Register? I'm looking at a recent article regarding cancer studies linked to drinking water. We have not been coordinating any kind of editorial response to this with the register or anything. But again, I would encourage anyone who's interested in writing a letter to the editor or an op-ed to do that, to again raise the profile of this issue. So if you're interested in, we're happy to help folks write letters and help submit them as well if you need assistance. So please reach out and let us know if we can be helpful in any way. All right. Well, thank you all again. And this recording is going to be up online, hopefully later today. And so we'll send out a follow-up email with a link to the recording and some other information. So yeah, thank you all again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.